Christian or not, religious or not, a human being innately understands that they're important. Even the person who says we're just a speck of dust in this grand universe, in this evolutionary process, they still buy themselves stuff. They still get an education. They still start families. They still understand how important they are and have their passions, political passions and whatever. We know that we're important. And if you try to satisfy that sense of importance in anything other than the divine, I would suggest that you are going to always feel lacking. I think what's helpful is to think about the perspective of God rather than our own perspective. We can be very myopic and this is my career path. These are the few people that I affect in my little job as a cashier at a gas station or whatever.
Sure. Yeah.
But God sees that, and I like to call it God's economy, his economy of love. He knows that person needs to have their gas tank filled because that person is going to do this and who's going to affect somebody else, who's going to affect somebody else. And if they can't fill up their gas tank, that's a problem for a lot of people. So it matters that you do your job well, right? And to remember that the rest of the world may not see it that way, but God does.
That is Dr. Michael Berg, and this is the Well Mind Podcast. The Well Mind is a space for meaningful conversations about a broad range of wellness-related topics, with a special emphasis on mental wellness. I'm your host, Dr. Ben Coles. It's so great to have you with me today, where we venture back into the familiar theme of vocation. This is a topic that has been featured on the Well Mind previously, but it's one that's so relevant to our everyday life that we will likely continue to draw from this well for deeper insights into ourselves and our relationships. And we do that today with my guest. He's a professor of apologetics at Wisconsin Lutheran College. He's a reverend, author, public speaker, and just all-around interesting dude. I was first introduced to Dr. Berg through his recent book, Vocation, The Setting for Human Flourishing, which we take a deep dive into in this conversation. But then later in the summer, I heard him speak at a conference and we got to talking and chatting, and I find out he does some of his own podcasting too. And so he was totally on board with coming onto the Well Mind and joining our community. Then, of course, the fall semester started, and him being a professor, me being a professor, it took us a little while to reconnect, but we did make it happen. And I'm thrilled to share this chat with you. We certainly cover a lot of ground, everything from what vocation is and why it's important, to topics related to vocation in marriage and parenting, how making sacrifices is different than self-sacrificing, and lastly, how vocation truly is the setting for human flourishing, as he says in his book title. All right, that's it. I'm ready. Are you ready? Yeah, let's do this thing. All right, here's my chat with Dr. Berg in episode 28 of the Well Mind Podcast, Human Flourishing. Welcome, Dr. Berg, to the Well Mind Podcast. It's wonderful to have you here with us. I've been looking forward to our conversation, and am just thrilled that we get to connect. I wish it was in person, honestly, but I know that with our schedules and the busyness of a semester, this is the best way for us to do it over video like this. So welcome. It's great to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
Well, so I think a great place to start as we kind of embark on our discussion today is just to start with a little bit of background on you. If you could just give us a little rundown of who you are, kind of where you're at, what you're up to, professionally, personally, whatever you think would be good for us to know about you, to get to know you a little bit.
Sure. Mike Berg, born in Missouri, lived in California and Michigan, bounced around a little bit and picked up my sports teams from all three of those places, the good ones, and left the bad ones behind. Was a pastor for 12 years in the Wisconsin Synod after graduating from Martin Luther College and then Wisconsin Lutheran Seminary. One of the best things I did was I took a year off between college and seminary and traveled in Europe for 3 months. So if we have any students listening, you should do that, right? The Canadians and the Australians, they just assume that you're going to take a year off and travel. I wish that was the case for us Americans. Now I learned more in that 3 months than probably I did a whole year of college, So that was formative for me. After I graduated, I was 12 years a pastor in Wood Lake, Minnesota, sort of in your neck of the woods. I was a city kid that got sent to a rural place and loved it, and then took a call to Wisconsin Lutheran College, where I'd been for 5 years and teach theology, apologetics, worship, Luther, some intro classes, Pauline epistles, or kind of whatever we need to be taught. My doctoral work was at Biola University, and it's a doctor of ministry I never intended to teach, and just had an itch for learning more, and was interested in apologetics, and did some apologetic work with Dr. John Montgomery in Strasbourg, and needed more. And so I followed J.P. Moreland, was a professor that I had heard of, and went to Biola because it was affordable and I didn't have to take a sabbatical. And when I had to come up with a doctoral project, Biola is an evangelical school, and they were very good to me and said, be Lutheran, we're not trying to convert you or anything. Well, when it came time to picking my topic, I wasn't going to do it on infant baptism or anything else that, would be a little bit controversial. That wasn't, and I settled on, because you had to have something that had to do with a little bit of philosophy. And so I settled on vocation, which I was very interested in. And specifically then the philosophical component, I suppose, would be human flourishing, eudaimonia, that concept in Greek, and in Hebrew, shalom. And so worked on a project there. And then eventually it became a book that I wrote that we're going to discuss today.
Yeah. Wonderful. As I'm listening, I'm thinking about, you writing this book that we're going to talk about on vocation. And the title is Vocation, the Setting for Human Flourishing. We're going to talk about that, but I think about the trajectory of your own life in terms of some of those experiences. I wonder how much of that how much of that impacted your interest in this area of vocation. Like you talked about growing up in California and spending time abroad and these kind of formative experiences. I don't know. Have you thought about that? Like what from those kind of early experiences maybe sparked or prompted you to have an interest in this area?
Sure. When it came to choosing my vocation, I'd like to say that was some existential crisis, but it wasn't. I'm fourth generation pastor. We don't know how to do anything else. So this is just what I was going to do. And never really doubted that at all. However, I think that there was a mindset of, if you have these skills and if you have the opportunity, then shouldn't you be doing Jesus work, right? As if I was somehow being morally superior to the lawyer or something like that. I never had that existential crisis, but later in life, I started to think about that, especially as I was serving people. And there was that question of a sanctified Christian. How do you serve the Lord if you're not in what we call full-time ministry? And the doctrine of vocation helped me destroy that thought, and ask the better question, ask a different question than what should a human being do, and start thinking about what God does through us. And wouldn't it be great if we were all pastors? Well, no, that would be terrible, right? And we've actually had times in history where I teach a Luther class here, where there were times in his early life or his formative years in school where every 10th person in the town was a monk. And it's not necessarily a good thing, because somebody's got to do the work of farming, and then studying more Luther and flipping that upside down and seeing that God cares very much about our everyday lives. And he uses the farmer and the garbage collector as much as he uses the mother, the father, the teacher, and the pastor. And so that was, I think, thinking more about Christians and how I would serve them as a pastor, and thinking about their good works and making sure that they're not thinking that these good works are earning favor with God. Well, then why do you do them? Well, you do them because it's God using you to love neighbor, and it's a high calling. And I think, since you asked about a personal question, I kind of only half jokingly said that my family, full of pastors, we don't know how to do anything. It's actually kind of true. And if I can look at a Greek text and I can find my way through that. But if you gave me a plumbing problem, I would look like a cow before a locked gate, right? And to start to appreciate as a father and as a husband, I'm very appreciative of all the people and their vocations who can do things that I cannot do very well, and start to appreciate those people and start to see their tasks as gifts that God is giving me, but also that the work themselves is an art, and it's not menial work, right? And the more I was a pastor, the more I would ask questions about people and their work with legitimate interest in what they did, no matter what it was, and to try to pull out of them a sense of pride, the right kind of pride, that they were doing something that was good and worthwhile. And so all of those kinds of things led me back to Luther, and then via Luther to the scriptures to relook at some of those passages, like in Ephesians 2, and to see things through not really a lens, but to have my ears open to vocational talk.
Yeah, it's never, well, I shouldn't expect this, but it's never a straight line, right?
Sure.
Where it's like, oh, I had this experience, and then I had this experience, and then it just became clear this is what I was going to be spending time studying and researching. And so there is a personal aspect for you in that there were some notions that you maybe had or held, or beliefs that were kind of passed along, or that you acquired along the way, that were more in line with kind of elevating the role of clergy, and maybe at times at the expense of other work, other jobs and tasks.
Yeah, whether I knew I was doing that or not, I was. Yeah.
Well, and that's the thing. Like our assumptions or our beliefs, they oftentimes operate underneath our awareness until we have something happen that draws our attention to them. It's hard to like get at our worldview or our beliefs without stepping back and being intentional with looking at them. And it sounds like you were presented with many opportunities to be able to do that personally, and then as a student as well. Yeah. So before we go too far into this, maybe it's important to just like define what are we really talking about when we say vocation, right? That word gets used in a few different contexts, and like a vocational school or something like that, or like people will talk about your vocational journey. And so when you are talking about vocation from your perspective, Mike, what are we really discussing?
Sure. I think it's helpful to start with a sense of station, and that's the language that the reformers used. And station in English, we can see the related word stand. This is where you stand before the world. And everybody has a station. It could be a family station, mother, father, son, daughter, a station with the local magistrate, the state, that would be a political one, but also what we would call today career, right? This is your station in life. And maybe just a side note, for Lutheran medieval culture, your station or your estate was tied to your bloodlines. You are nobility, or you are commoner, or you are clergy. And he flipped that upside down and said it's more about your identity being in Christ, first of all, but then where has God placed you? So everybody has a station. The atheist lawyer has a station. For the Christian, it becomes a calling, and that's where we get the term vocation. You can hear the word voice there. So it seems obvious, but it's very important to understand a calling has three components: the caller, the person called, and then the neighbor. So God's the caller, and the Christian in their station then feels a sense of calling. He may not do a better job than his atheist lawyer that's in the cubicle next to him, but certainly has a sense of calling that the atheist lawyer does not have. And then the big deal is that it's the neighbor. And so you're curved outward towards neighbor rather than yourself. And kind of an interesting thing with that word vocation for people in Luther's day, and of course, he's the one that makes vocation. He kind of solidifies that. It's always been there, but he solidifies this doctrine for us historically. Vocation would have been calling to the clergy class, so a nun or a priest or a monastic. And that's still the case today in Roman Catholic circles. If you would take a vocation, you would be taking holy orders. You would be getting orders. You would have a call, and you've been getting orders from God. And Luther, in his small catechism, kind of takes a little jab at that, where at the end of the small catechism, he has what's called the table of duties, which is passages and advice about stations in life: father, mother, employer, or employee. And he says, these are your holy orders, right? He was jabbing that. And so today, vocation is, like you said, vocational school as in different than the liberal arts. Probably a better way to think about that would be the servile arts, right? You're getting something that is it's a technical kind of education, whether it be accounting or engineering or carpentry or something like that. But the truth of the matter is that we are all in vocations. We all have our calling. What's kind of interesting about that is, as I did some research, I took the time to find some more secular voices about jobs, and a lot of them would bring up the concept of calling, that people have a sense of calling, even if they're not Christian, even if they're doing construction work, and that it's something that is inbuilt in us. And if you can have a sense of calling, and from their perspective, if you as an employer can instill a sense of calling in your employees, you're going to get more production, and you're going to have happier workers and stuff like that. So even if you've never heard the word vocation, you can kind of feel that sense of calling. Now, the sense of calling for today for a lot of people, and this I think would dovetail into your work as a psychologist and thinking about that, is it's a curved inward concept. So I have a sense of calling because this is what I like to do, or this is what I'm good to do, or this is what I'm moved to do. It's a very curved inward looking for my purpose, where the doctrine of vocation is much more about being curved outward towards neighbor. And so you have a calling to serve neighbor. And so it's about God's love through me to somebody else. And I would argue, I'm getting ahead of myself here, but I would argue that the sense of purpose that we all desire really cannot be fulfilled unless you're lifted higher than yourself. And this is where the doctrine of vocation, I think, is just so applicable to Christian counseling, to preaching in the pulpit, to how we raise our children, what kind of questions we ask about their future careers. So that's kind of the nutshell, the basics of vocation. And maybe one last thought about vocation proper, if we want to call it that way, is you have multiple vocations. And I would, in modern America, I would put them into four categories. This is somewhat arbitrary, but You have your churchly vocation. Are you pastor? Are you lay member? Are you teaching Sunday school? You have your civic vocation. You're a citizen of a country, a state, a city. Maybe you're on the town council. You have your family vocation, which are a variety of ones, and then what we would call career, but vocation of where you have an occupation, right? And that's a tough category, because what about the retired person, the unemployed person, the stay-at-home parent? Well, I would shoehorn those into career, right? And certainly those are valuable, of course. So I'll leave it at that for now.
Yeah. No, well, and I mean that you touch on a few things here. As you were talking, I was thinking about purpose and meaning as you were discussing calling, and you ended up using that word purpose, and how there's a different way of understanding where we derive our meaning and purpose in life. And when you were talking about maybe a more secular or worldly kind of experience of, like feeling called to do something, that's really located in myself. That it's like, oh, I'm good at this, or I really enjoy this, or I have a lot to offer in this area. But it is a lot of like I statements.
Mm-hmm.
But the shift that you're suggesting and encouraging here from a biblical perspective then is deriving meaning and purpose through our relationships with others. And it seems like, how did you put it? Like Christ through me to another. Is that accurate?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And so talk a little bit about just that process of deriving meaning from that perspective of not something that's, oh, I feel really good about this because I like doing it. I think I hear that all the time, that's almost ubiquitous in our culture of like, I do this thing because I really enjoy it, or it gives me a lot of satisfaction. But what you're talking about here is a different way of deriving that. Can you expand on that?
Sure. And maybe one thing to start out with is, if you find an occupation that you love and you're passionate about, and you are an artist and you were able to make a living an artist, wonderful, and that is a blessing of other people in their vocations, being able to hire you, or being a client funding you or something like that. And that's a beautiful world when we can line up all of our children and say, this is what you're good at, passionate about, and we got a job for you, right? It's a broken world.
Yeah.
The problem, of course, is that it is a broken world. And sometimes the philosophy major is going to have to, find an accounting job because he has to pay the mortgage, right? If you limit yourself, and I think this is the language that we should think about, when you're trying to only fulfill your own desires, find your own contentment, it's not just selfish. I want to be careful not to throw that word around, because that can be unfair, but that you really are going to be settling for something lower than what God has intended for you to be. And let me put it this way, that Christian or not, religious or not, a human being innately understands that they're important. Even the person who says we're just a speck of dust in this grand universe, in this evolutionary process, they still buy themselves stuff. They still get an education. They still start families. They still understand how important they are, and have their passions, political passions, and whatever. We know that we're important. And if you try to satisfy that sense of importance in anything other than the divine, I would suggest that you are going to always feel lacking. You may try to convince yourself that you're content, but I think we understand that we are made for something grand and big. And so how do you do that? Um, I think one dead end is going to be money, privilege, the promotion, all of those things. I say this a lot to our students that I totally sympathize and understand the NFL quarterback who makes $30 million a year and still feels disrespected and wants more money and more praise. He's made in the image of God. He understands that. And so unless you have like a divine purpose, I think there will always be something lacking. The other dead end, or I should say, trap that we can get ourselves into is if we pursue things only to fulfill ourselves. Well, in the history of the world, and even today, that's not going to work out for a lot of people, right? Because not everybody gets to be the senator from Minnesota. Not everybody gets to be the CEO. Not everybody gets to be the artist. So you're going to have to find some sort of meaning in the gritty day-to-day reality of this world, broken or not. And I think vocation really helps you do that because you're lifted above yourself. So the bus driver who maybe when he was 4 years old or 5 years old never wanted to be the bus driver. Although, side note, we can learn a lot from 5 and 6 year olds because they actually want to be the bus driver and think that's really cool. And somehow we get jaded and somehow think that the guy hanging on the end of the garbage truck is somehow less than me. But when I was 6 years old, that was pretty darn cool. So, we get a little bit jaded. But to start thinking about the bus driver doesn't deserve to be the bus driver. He is lifted beyond himself because he's doing God's work. And God's work is taking people from point A to point B and doing it safely. What could be more divine? What could be more meaningful? What could be more purposeful than that? And from there, if you understand that your purpose is beyond just making a paycheck or just scratching the itch that will never, ever, ever be satisfied, that's when you can start finding pride in your work. When you find pride in your work, then your day-to-day life is meaningful and full and robust and intellectually engaging. And that has a lot to do with mental health, doesn't it? Right? Mm-hmm. So maybe I'm rambling here, but let me tell you just kind of one kind of analogy. One that I learned as a pastor, and that is ask somebody about what they do. And you'll be able to tell right away if they have a sense of calling or not. I don't care what job it is. They'll start talking about the craft. They'll say, this is the right way to do things. This is the wrong way to do things. It may be couched in complaint, where they complain about the vendors or the boss or the whatever, but it's a sense of this is the right way to do things. And I do things the right way. Well, they're talking about craft. And when you are engaged in your day-to-day life with a sense of the right way, the wrong way to do things, with pride and learning how to do things in a better way, that's good for your mental health. And you start to realize from a theological point of view, this vocation thing, as much as it is about God using me to serve other people in a sacrificial way, this was a gift that God gave me. This was a gift God gave me for a sense of purpose, I'm going to throw around buzzwords you would know better, but self-esteem, all those things that we laymen, when it comes to psychology, kind of think about, but probably not in depth. Our job has a lot to do with our identity and our self-esteem and our purpose and our self-worth and all of those things. And it's really good that God gave me a job to do, right? This is really a gift from God as much as it is a gift that I give to other people.
Yeah. Can I tell you a quick story?
Sure.
I was coming back from Atlanta on an airplane just recently, about a month ago. And, it's not a super long flight from Atlanta to Minneapolis, but, long enough that you kind of, you can only watch so many reruns of a show or something like that on the screen. And I was on the aisle, and there's a seat in between, and then that was open, and then the lady was sitting by the window, and so I just started visiting with her and asked her where she was going and what she had been doing, and I don't even know how it happened, but we got on the topic of what she did. And I think she was just sharing some things about her family, and actually, and so she's been a quilter for her whole life, and she does these things called star quilts. And I don't know if you're familiar with that. I wasn't. I could kind of imagine what it was, but it's a pattern of a star on the quilt, and they're usually fairly large, and very common within like Native American culture. And so what she got to do, though, was that she was this kind of master star quilter, and at the local community college, she would teach other men and women in her community how to quilt. And this was a way that she was kind of sharing something that brought her a lot of joy. But the point about making a star quilt is not to keep it. That was the thing that she kept emphasizing over and over, that you make these quilts to give them away, to give them to somebody else. And that was like her whole purpose. Really, her sense of identity and value was very much wrapped in, I get to do this thing that I can then share and give away to all these other people. And, super humble lady. But like, it's her story that came into my mind as you were talking about that. Like, there was an example of a person who was doing something with the specific purpose of like serving her neighbor, of doing something for someone else. And yeah, she took a lot of pride and joy in doing the work, but if she just had to do it for herself, I don't think it would have the same meaning. The meaning was really connected with being able to give that away.
Yeah, and I think that the key for the person who is maybe in a job where it's not so obvious that I'm doing something for somebody else, right? A doctor, a nurse, a pastor, a teacher, a quilter, all of those things have a built-in, I'm giving something out for somebody else, right? I'm doing this for somebody else. But I think the key is to get our people, if I can speak pastorally there, is to see that whatever job they are in, they are doing it for somebody else. And it can be very difficult working in a cubicle, but it matters what you do. It matters for the company that serves other people, even if that company doesn't always have the best ethics, right? But it's an imperfect world.
Yeah.
To say that if I'm making a widget and I never get to see the final product or whatever, it still matters. It absolutely does. And it's as much as a gift to the world as was a star quilt, right? It's just, it's kind of a different mindset. And I think what's helpful is to think about the perspective of God rather than our own perspective. We can be very myopic and this is my career path. These are the few people that I affect in my little job as a cashier at a gas station or whatever.
Sure. Yeah.
But God sees and I like to call it God's economy, his economy of love. He knows that person needs to have their gas tank filled because that person is going to do this and who's going to affect somebody else, who's going to affect somebody else. And if they can't fill up their gas tank, that's a problem for a lot of people. So it matters that you do your job well, right? And to remember that the rest of the world may not see it that way, but God does. And if you can understand that, the analogy I like to use is you clean your bathroom with pride, and the kids come and they destroy the place in 5 minutes, and nobody said thank you.
Yes, they do.
That's for sure. And you never got a thank you. Nobody ever said that was a really good job this time. God sees it and you see it, right? And that satisfaction from getting a thank you from your kids, while nice, was never going to scratch the itch of you being created in the image of God and made for something great, right?
Yeah.
So I don't think you can be fulfilled unless you understand that this is God looking down and saying, well done, good and faithful servant.
Mm-hmm.
And you only get that freedom if you're so secure in the love of Christ that he says, your job performance is not going to be about your standing with me. You are righteous in Christ, period, full stop, end of thought. And now I'm going to use you, and this is going to be a prideful thing for you. And I know you're going to mess it up because you're sinful, but I'm still going to get the work done through you. Once you get that freedom, that opens up quite a few doors, and you see what God is doing. You're not burdened by it. It's again, the language is gift. God is giving gift to your neighbor, and he's giving a gift to you as well.
So I want to jump in here too, because this really connects in with, I think, a cool metaphor that you use in the book, and I want to kind of dig into this a little bit more. You talk about God's love being like a waterfall, kind of crashing down on us, and that there's kind of a process of us like funneling or channeling that water that we're receiving from God, like off of us and onto other people. I'm not doing it justice. Can you kind of explain that picture of this God's waterfall of love?
Sure. That was good. I usually think about this in the context of worship, that when Sunday morning is about getting from God, we kind of think about it as we pay homage to God as if he needed us.
Yeah.
And,
okay. Like we're going to church and that's for God. We're doing something for God by going to church.
Right. And that makes God at best insecure, at worst a narcissist, right? And he says, come and let me feed you, right? That this is me coming to give you stuff. And then I think Romans chapter 12, verse 1, where St. Paul talks about living and dying for our neighbor, and that's vocational talk, or at least I think I connected to it. This is your true worship. And in fact, the Greek word there is where we get our word liturgy from. And so Sunday is where I get the waterfall of God's grace. And if I try to throw that water back up to God, he just shoves it back down upon me. So it's good and right and salutary that we pray, praise, and give thanks to God. But who benefits? Well, I do, right? And so the water comes back crashing down upon me. So what am I supposed to do with all of this love? Well, I give it away, right? And so I imagine water crashing down upon me, and I stick out my arm, and the water runs down my arm and through my fingers to my wife, to my students, to my neighbors, to fellow citizens. And it comes with all the dirt, and it falls through my fingers because it is not perfect. I will mess it up, but it's still God's love. And it's through me to the neighbor. And maybe just two quick analogies there. I think this is the way you should think about your marriage and all of your vocations, is to say, God says, I choose, for my case, Amanda, my wife's name, and says, God says to Michael, me, I got this woman, Amanda, I want her to be adored and loved and respected and encouraged, and I'm going to choose you to do it. And so it's an honor for me to be married, as the love of God goes through me, and then to my wife. The other thing about this, which I think is fascinating, is I don't have the patience, talent, time to really fulfill the calling of being Christ to my bride, of being an icon of the Father to my children, of being the icon of the teacher to my students. Forget about my sinful selfishness. I just can't do it. And so it seems to me that there's a limit. Somehow I limit God's love because I have a capacity of love. But then again, if it's God's love, then it is infinite. And God's going to get his work done with or without us. And I find that extremely comforting, that God's going to get his work done. that he has created good deeds in advance for me to do. And it takes the pressure off me a little bit. And so my motivation then is not this burdensome, oh, nothing's going to get done if I don't do it. You know how we throw ourselves that little pity party, right? Like my whole, the whole company is going to fall apart if I don't do this. The motivation then becomes a correct pride in wanting to be a part of this thing that is bigger than me, and being joyful about that. So when we think about, and if I may go back to Romans chapter 12, where Paul calls us living sacrifices, which is an oxymoron. A sacrifice by definition, especially back then, would have been dead.
Yeah, but that was a dead thing that you would kill. Yeah.
So, but you have to remember that Paul's been talking this whole time in Romans about the old and the new man, the sinner and the saint. And that in Romans chapter 6, that the sinner dies with Christ and is buried, and then what is resurrected is a new creation. And so I, as a sinner saint living out in this world in my vocations, I am, schizophrenic's not the right word, but it's an analogy that we sometimes use. I'm 100% sinner and 100% saint. The old Adam, the sinner, the old person in me, is by definition selfish. He can't do anything but sin. This is Paul's language in the end of chapter 6 and going into 7. The sinner has a new master. The master is sin. So he cannot do anything but sin. So I'm always going to be turned into myself. And so this is the part of me that looks at my colleagues and annoyed, and tries to give up and says, I only do this for a paycheck, right? That's a curved inward thing. But the saint, and that's my true identity, I'm righteous in Christ, finds the neighbor as a delight and can't help but want to help out. And I think every single person listening to this has had moments on both sides where you want to do something good just because it's good. You're not thinking about credit, you're not thinking about paycheck, you're not thinking about anything, you just want to do it. And there are times when you're, of course, the opposite. So now back to the dying and rising, this living sacrifice. When in my vocation, I give up of my time. Let's take the picture of a mother, because that's much, much more full. Literally dying, right? The body is, if anybody dies for her children, it's a mother, right? Giving up of her body or time or energy, all of these things. She dies to herself, but when she dies, she is resurrected and lives to somebody else. And so it is this death and resurrection, this baptismal life in action, in vocation. And when I do sacrifice, and it's painful, it is painful, but it's the old man who's dying. It's a good death. It's a good pain. It's a good suffering, because I am dying to myself to live for somebody else. And that's it's very Christological.
Yeah, so much good stuff there, Mike, really. And I so deeply appreciate your reverence for motherhood. I've heard you, I heard you speak previously back in August, and even just listening to you today, like you have such a reverence and appreciation and value for motherhood. And I just love that every time I hear the way you talk about that. So there's two things though that I want to key in on here. First of all, it's that partner relationship between husband and wife. That's a little bit of where you kind of started is, like in your example, you said, I'm choosing you, Mike, to show this love, kindness, compassion, appreciation to Amanda. Like God wants that for her, just like he wants that for all of his people, but he's choosing you to be that vessel in which it gets delivered. And for me, like as a mental health counselor, and I've done a lot of couple therapy over the years, and there, when things are going wrong, there's this divide where each person in the relationship is talking about themselves and talking about either what they're not getting, or receiving, what they're not experiencing in the relationship. It's very much, to use your language, that curved inward. And one of the hardest tasks is to do something in an unconditional way for the other person, because everything has become so conditional. Well, I'll only do this if I'm getting this, or I'll only try that if they're going to try this as well. And I use that language, of being conditional and unconditional, and that this really only works in a, flourishing way, or a really healthy way, when we can approach it by setting aside our own needs and wants and being able to just give to the other person. But that takes so much energy and effort. So I don't know. Do you have thoughts here that you could share in terms of an encouragement? Like, if somebody's feeling pretty tapped out in their marriage relationship and they're hearing this and they're like, how am I going to do that? Like, how am I going to be Christ to my bride or to my husband when I feel so kind of let down or empty right now?
Yeah. I wrote a note down here to not forget to say something about this, because there are listeners out there who inevitably say, this is all very cute, but let me tell you about my life, right?
Yeah,
I can think about
too idealistic.
Yeah, I can think about I always use the example of a subsistence farmer in a third world country who should be an engineer. And that's all cute. This is all very middle class American talk. Well, yes, I understand that. And the reason that they're not in that position where they can relate very easily is because people had sinned against their vocations, whether it be the corruption of government, whether it be big time companies that did not appreciate were unfaithful in their uses of resources, whatever it is.
Yeah.
But that person,
or any list of social injustice,
right,
that happens in our country and around the world. Yep.
But that person still matters, right? Because he or she is still doing love, right, in a broken world. And I do like to say that, there's not, we're not talking about levels of heaven here, and we're certainly not talking about earning God's salvation. But when I read Revelation and hear about the people coming up from the Great Tribulation, that seems to me that the people in heaven and Jesus, for sure, knew about their struggles, and they're not forgotten. They're not forgotten. And so sometimes that's the only pastoral advice you can give. To relate that to marriage, that language of unconditional and conditional love. I mean, that's Pauline language, right? Where he says, if it's not a gift, right, unconditional, then it's a wage, right? It's a wage that you're earning, right? It's a conditional thing. It's a quid pro quo relationship. You do this and then I do that. And I think that you've left the realm of love then. You certainly have left the realm of gift. And if you want to get paid, well, we know that the wages of sin is death, right? And so, to think about, this is hard, because let's just go to the extreme of a person who has been beaten down emotionally, if not physically, by their partner. Mm-hmm. And the pastor says, well, you got to love more, right? It's not always very, very helpful.
It isn't.
It is not. Yeah. And so while the command there is still to love, I think what you can do in a vocational sense is to steer that person out to, okay, but you're not all alone in this. There are other people in their vocation serving you. And I'm not just meaning the therapist or the pastor or your family, but just the variety of vocations that have been used for your food, for your shelter, for your enjoyment, all of these things. and to say that you are not alone in this, and that God has given you many good gifts, right? And I know it's a little bit cheesy, but I think it's can be a helpful practice to say to somebody, let's list all the good things in your life right now. And it's not a perfect world. And you may have a troubled marriage, but you are not starving to death. You're not in danger. You're not whatever. And there are people in those situations in this broken world. And I'm sorry that you're here. But let's build off of these positive things. And then maybe this is an area where you're going to have to sacrifice a little bit more. And then to appreciate the people that you do lean on, your parents, your friends, and all of those kinds of things. I don't know if that's, it's so hard to deal with, right, in the abstract. And there are no answers to sin other than Jesus Christ. And for some people, it is, here's the cross that you have to bear. But this burden is carried with Christ, and it's going to only be temporary. And I think that one last thought, and this dovetails into the theology of the cross, is that God gives us permission to enter the darkness, right? He says, I don't want you to necessarily run away from this cross, but to say, you can run towards it. And there is a light at the end of the tunnel. It may not be till heaven. I can't guarantee anything. But what he does do is he says, take my hand and we can go through this cross together, since we've already died at the cross in baptism already. So, it's tough, isn't it?
Yeah.
And we got to be very careful.
It is. And I appreciate you kind of like, okay, well, if we play it out to the extreme sense, and in a case of there being a cycle of abuse and issues of power and control dynamics in a marriage relationship, that there are other things at work there that are also needing to be considered. And of course, from a counseling standpoint, it's like safety is always the number one priority. And it's like, well, at no point are you, sacrificing in a way that puts you at danger in that sense. But if we kind of then walk it back from that into, where most marriages are, and that there are seasons to marriages, that, there are seasons where a couple is feeling really connected and they're in step with one another, and kind of, they're supporting one another. And then there are times when you get out of sync and out of step. And it's at those times where it's like, well, I don't, it's like my needs aren't being met, or, like something, my partner's going through something. And so that means I'm not able to receive from them the love and support that I normally would, because of, illness, whether that be physical or emotional or whatever. But, putting it in that context of just normal everyday marriages, it's like, it is a paradigm shift to be able to see myself as having an opportunity to show God's love to my partner. Like, that's a blessing that I get to be, and that God has called me, in this vocation to do that, to be a co-worker with him in delivering this love and appreciation. And I do also, want to highlight and appreciate what you said too about, like, we can't pour from an empty cup. And so what that means in this sense is that there are other sources where I can receive, that love or admiration or sense of connectedness, whether that's, from a close friend, from a family member, whatever the case may be, while I'm working on, this marriage relationship. That I'm not going to be making withdrawals from the marriage relationship necessarily, but I'm just focused on making deposits there. So I'm collecting, I'm using a different metaphor here now, but I'm getting income, I'm collecting things from other places so that I can make those emotional deposits.
Yeah, I think that's a great analogy. And just to stop and if you did the list of blessings, maybe the list of vocations that are serving you. And the reason I say that is because God's going to get his work done. And sometimes the sphere of influence of a particular vocation um, can grow, can expand, or get smaller, right? Depending on things.
Mm-hmm.
And so we got to be careful that we're not heaping more guilt upon people. And it's okay. You don't have to go to every little league game. My parents didn't,
Yeah.
it's okay
Yeah.
that it's okay if your career path gets interrupted because you need to spend more time with your in your marriage or with your family. Um, and there'll be other people that will pick up the slack. It'll be okay because remember, God prepared good deeds in advance for you to do. And I think that one analogy that somebody else uses is, well, love knows no program. Love needs to go where it needs to go. And if it's in your marriage right now, you can feel, even though it's a disorder and it's not right, you don't have to feel guilty about saying, I can't be a good friend to you right now because my kid's sick. Or I can't do that extra project at work, which may cost me a promotion because I need to spend time with family, and vice versa.
Yeah.
And so the question is, who needs your love the most right there? And then to be acutely aware then of that happening to you, right? That there are times when people in their vocation, whether they know it or not, are taking time out of, they're dying to themselves for you. And to really appreciate the web of God's economy of love, that he's got you. He's got you. And you think about a boss saying to somebody who has a kid with cancer, and he says, you know what, I got you for the next month. We'll figure it out. You're not going to take a pay cut. Go. I feel that that's the language of God very often in these concepts of vocation, where he says, you know what, I got you. Go do what you need to do. I will get the work done, right? And if it's God's work, it'll be fine.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm going to read something back to you, a quote from your book here. Vocation is not an ethical theory, but it is a touchstone. We may cause one neighbor to suffer for the sake of another in a complicated world. The work will get done because it is his work. I think referring to God's work. So I think that kind of captures in a nutshell what you're saying here is when we're trying our best to use our discernment and we do ask that question, who needs my love the most right now? That because we might say both of these people or both of these things or both of these vocations need it. And I could give to both, but then how do I give to one without feeling tremendous guilt over not giving to the other? And there's grace in this, right? There, in what you're talking about here, because the work is going to get done. So even if you're not the one doing it in that very moment, God's going to still find a pathway for that person to experience love in a different way.
And never to feel guilty about the gifts that have been given to you, right? If your boss in his or her vocation has given you a bonus that deep down in your heart you probably don't deserve, well, that's God's love, and take a vacation, right? You should never feel God. And so part of where we get into these problems where we're burnt out or whatever, I would venture to guess that you've seen this a gazillion times, is that people don't take the gifts that are being handed to them. And they think that they should feel guilty about the money that they get. They should feel guilty about the time that they are allotted off from work, right? Americans are notorious for not fulfilling their 2 weeks of vacation, right? And it really, whether we're being selfish or not, we are, because we're trying to justify ourselves by saying, I have to work, I have to work, I have to work, I have to do this, I have to do this. Where God is saying, I'm handing you a gift, and this gift is going to pay dividends a year from now, 2 years, 3 years from now, because you gained an experience, you gained a joy, you recharged from taking time off. And I speak as this as a person who does not follow my own preaching on this, right? But I'm slowly learning to enjoy God's good gifts, including rest, without the guilt.
Yeah.
If God is giving me this through the vocation of my employer, of my wife, of my children, whatever gift they give me of time, of money, of a vacation, of whatever it is, that if I turn that gift down, well, I'm really turning the gift of the Creator down. And that just seems a little silly to me, right?
Yeah.
And so to list those things, like we said, list all the blessings that you have, but then that's a whole nother thing, is to actually enjoy them guilt-free, right? And I think that may be a huge problem, especially in our modern American concept.
Yeah. And you're getting at kind of a question that I had for you in thinking about our time together, that it is true, vocation involves sacrifice. Whatever, whether that's with our family or with our work, or the other two categories, church and civic, it involves sacrifice. But how do we stay out of the, I guess, mentality or just the behavior of perpetually self-sacrificing? And I don't know if you know what I mean by that,
Sure.
because when I think of self-sacrificing, like, there's a difference between making sacrifices and self-sacrificing, where we're kind of like, well, to use the original picture of the term, like kind of killing ourselves in kind of service of something else.
Yeah, and I think that's where you need a good friend, you need a therapist, you need a preacher, you need a spouse that says to you point blank, you're doing too much. And that can be dangerous, because it can be dangerous theologically, because you start to see, you may start to think like, this is my identity, as doing good for God, glory of God, all of this kind of stuff, instead of enjoying God's good gifts, right? And you may have to say it pointedly, to say, don't reject this gift from God, right? And this is for your benefit, and it will be for the benefit of other people, because you'll be a more delightful person, probably, right? So,
Hopefully.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on the personality, right? I mean,
Yeah.
I've had people that I've ministered to where I had the kind of relationship where we could say things that were very pointed, and their feelings wouldn't get hurt, where you can say, you know what, you need to get over yourself, right? You need to get over yourself. You're not that important that you can't enjoy this good gift that God is giving you. But sometimes, you think about like an elderly person who gave, and now they're not able to do it, and they feel like their value is somehow lessened because they weren't able to give anymore. Retired person, right?
Yeah.
The lady in your church who did everything but now can't. And I tell you, I've had many of deathbed experiences where people who have been in church every Sunday, and they still say, Pastor, I tried really hard, or they feel guilty that their grandchildren are coming to visit them and stuff like this. And you have to say, man, you're really close to the work righteousness that we were kind of harping around for your whole life about not falling into. But also to say, do you understand how you bring great joy to people when they serve you? You found joy when you served people, admit it, right? And now can you be that source of joy for other people? I mean, I think about my children when they were little, and the unconditional love of a parent, right? We talk about that. And I go, you know what? I think it's the exact opposite. I mean, my daughters love dad mostly because they didn't know me well enough yet, right? Right? They love me unconditionally, right? Yeah. I remember saying to my wife, like, when they grow up, who's going to greet me at the door? This is going to be terrible.
Yeah.
And I can see that as when you are being served, right? And show appreciation for that. This too, in a roundabout way, is a vocation, right? I like to, when I was in the parish, I would say there is such a thing as a vocation of being a patient. That's a weird thing to think about, but if I've been in enough hospitals to know that a patient can make a nurse's day or break a nurse's day really quick. And so
100%.
you can, you can be a delight or you can be a pain in you know what. So you're always serving people in a Christian way, whether you're retired, if you're disabled, if you're this or that. Even as people are serving you, you can be a delight to them. You are giving them, if for no other reason, then you are giving them a purpose, and you are giving them an avenue to grow. You're giving them a sense of value and a sense of pride, right? I mean, that's not nothing.
It's very much something, absolutely, to say yes to allowing somebody else to serve you, and doing that with a joyful attitude. It really gets at the flourishing aspect of what you talk about in the book too, is like when this system that God has set up, when it's working well, and even in a broken world, and you can see this happening, that there's so much, health and wellness that emerges from that.
Absolutely, yeah.
So let's just talk about that aspect of human flourishing here. I don't know if it's a favorite of you, the number 4, or if it's just how things seem to fall into 4s in this topic. But like, you talk about prosperity, security, freedom, and purpose as these kind of like aspects of flourishing. And I feel like we've been talking a lot about purpose today, and then we haven't used the word freedom, but that's a theme or a thread throughout this whole discussion, that we're free to do these things, right? Free to be in our vocation, serving one another, kind of being the director of God's waterfall of love onto other people. So what else do you want to say here about these aspects of human flourishing?
Sure. I usually start with the concept of shalom, which is a Hebrew word, which most people would identify as a greeting or peace, translated as peace, but it's really much more than that. And there are times actually when it is translated into English as security or prosperity. And the root is kind of a sense of wholeness. Even we could jump words and say holistic in a certain sense, that there's a spiritual, emotional, theological, but also physical side. Although shalom was never used as an internal peace, but more outward. Most famously, the prophet Jeremiah said to the exiles living in Babylon, "Work for the shalom of the city you live in," which is a remarkable thing to say to the people in the exile. What he meant there was, plant your vineyards, start your families, live your life, work for the good of those around you. So I think about shalom as peacetime versus wartime. Peacetime is when the economy is rolling, schools are open. Wartime is when things are bad. In the Old Testament, we may think of the opposite of shalom as sin. So shalom is the way it's supposed to be. There's an order. Sin disrupts that. It's a disorder. So when I think about a human flourishing, what does it mean to live a good life? Purpose is a big deal that we've talked about. But you can't flourish if you are in prison. So there needs to be at least a certain amount of freedom. If your only task is to figure out how you're going to feed your children one meal a day, it's not really flourishing.
No, it's
so
just
there needs
surviving.
Right. So that certainly there's a certain amount of prosperity, security for the same reason. If you're afraid of being hit by sniper fire, that's hardly flourishing. Now there's vocation comes from this concept of two sides. One is, well, how are you going to get security, freedom, all those things? Well, vocation, right? The farmer the police officer, the teacher, all of those kinds of things. But from the purpose side, again, I need a reason to get out of bed in the morning. And so to truly flourish, I need to have some of the spiritual aspect of that. I have a meaning, I have a cause in a good way. And so God gives us the gift of vocation that way. What's interesting about that is that there's a parallel Greek idea, eudaimonia, which is translated as happiness into English, but it's like shalom and peace. Happiness and eudaimonia, it doesn't really quite fit. There's more to the story. And that's important for us in the American context because the word happiness in our founding doctrines, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, is not a feeling. It's not a hedonistic feeling where you have more good than bad, but it was human flourishing, that we would go homestead, that we would start schools and churches and businesses and stuff like that. It's a holistic, it's the whole thing. It's wholesome. It's what's good. All of those sorts of things. And so when I say human flourishing, I would start with, you need to have the freedom from the burden of pleasing God. You need to be curved outward to see neighbor. And those two things are theological things. And so the Greek concept of eudaimonia and the American concept of the pursuit of happiness are fine, but there's that component of true freedom and value that is grounded as being an image bearer of God, and that the people that I serve, my neighbors, also have value because of that image, and to know that God is using them for my flourishing, right? Yeah. He's using the mechanic down the street fixing my car right now is God's way of allowing me to flourish, right? Yeah. To participate in this economy, whether as a person who is a worker or as a consumer, for hopefully my benefit.
I hope so. And you have no idea how applicable that last one is, because I just had my van towed from the parking lot this morning to the dealership because it's broken down and wouldn't start. So to, grace and mercy to the mechanic that's working on it today.
Right. And the trick is to then to appreciate all the people in their vocations, even when you don't have to have your car towed. The people that the electrician, the people you don't even know are working to keep the lights on and you safe and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. But it takes intention, right? And I talk about that a lot on the podcast, is just bringing intention to whatever it is we're doing. So whether it's being intentional with identifying that list of blessings and saying, this is hard and I have these blessings. I am making a sacrifice in this area and I'm receiving, the sacrificial love of someone else in this other area, or it's pausing in this sense and experiencing a sense of appreciation and gratitude for all the things that are happening to contribute to where I'm at right now. And I don't know, praising God for that.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Yeah. Mike, it's been an awesome conversation with you. I've really enjoyed how, you have such a wealth of and depth of knowledge in this area, but through our conversation, you've really been able to make it, I think, accessible and tangible for people too. I mean, I'm not a Greek, I'm not a Hebrew language person. That those are all in your wheelhouse, and I'm so grateful for that. But I also feel like I have a really good sense of exactly what this means in my life today. And so I hope that our listeners also have that too. If people want to dive into this a bit more, I'm strongly encouraging them to get your book, Vocation: The Setting for Human Flourishing. It's pretty much available everywhere, I think, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
And I would encourage them, 1517, the number is 1517.org is the publisher. And they also, they just have a wealth of great information that I think hopefully your listeners would benefit from. But there's also a course they have. kind of mini courses, like great courses kind of things. And
Oh, sure.
they had me do one on vocation. And so if you want to listen while you're reading or
Yeah.
listen instead of reading, that's a free resource at 1517.org as well.
Super cool. Yeah, they put out a ton of good stuff. I really appreciate some of the devotional work that they do, and yeah, good, just solid content for sure. So 1517.org. I'll put the link in the show notes for this episode, along with a link to where people can find your book. Do you have any kind of I know as a faculty over at Wisconsin Lutheran College, I'm sure you have some kind of outward facing things, anything that you want to also mention or encourage our listeners to check out that maybe is related to other content you're producing?
Well, we do have a podcast that's Let the Bird Fly, where a couple of our colleagues in the theology department, we do sometimes weekly content, sometimes we don't. Depends on how we're feeling that week. But we do regular ones, but then we also have things that are what we call Winging It series. And so we've done the Life and Thought of Luther. We're up to they're each about a half hour, 45-minute sessions, and we're into number 50 something right now. And
cool.
We still have things to go. So if you want to slowly go through the life of Luther, we got that. We did one on church history that's much shorter. We did one on the liturgy, which I'm hoping to turn into a book. We'll see.
Okay.
But working on some stuff on the baptismal life, kind of thinking more theologically about what it means to be baptized. And that, of course, is going to play into vocation as well as we live and die in this world. So that's sort of what I'm working on right now. But mostly I just drive teenage girls around, my daughters, to where they need to get. So
you don't have a driver yet?
We actually do, but she is on campus here in the dorms. So
okay.
The next one's coming soon, and then that will be a reprieve, for time, but not when it comes to my anxiety. So
yeah, yeah, it is. My vocation as chauffeur has definitely diminished over the last year because my oldest is driving, and so the two that are in high school and sports and stuff, they're able to kind of manage themselves a little bit. Yeah. And he's a good driver, so I don't get too anxious about it. And
you have to sit him down and say, this is the vocation of brother, and that is to drive your siblings around.
It is. I'm passing this on to you. All right, Mike, awesome. Thank you so much for coming on the Well Mind podcast. Appreciate your time.
Thank you so much. It was an honor.
A huge thank you to Dr. Berg for joining the Well Mind community, and thank you for spending your time with me today. If you enjoyed this conversation, please check out the previous episodes, subscribe through your podcast app, do all that kind of good rating, clicking, subscribing, all of that good stuff. And please, if you have time, take a moment to review the show if you found our discussion meaningful to you. Word of mouth is great too. Let people know what you're listening to. Share the Well Mind with them so that we can spread the word. And please check out the links in the show notes so that you can pick up Dr. Berg's book on vocation and check out any of the other resources that we referenced in our conversation. Many thanks, as always, to the staff here in the Bethany Lutheran College podcast studio. Seth and Greg are always tremendous in providing technical support and editing for the podcast. Special thanks to Lauren McMacken, too, for designing the logo and the cover art. Thanks again for listening, and until next time, be well.